I don't know,
Was that
writerly.
one-handed or two-handed?
It was actually pretty
I
much.
had a more sophisticated question for the record, but let's go with yours.
I think it was more two-handed because
Okay. Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
How many people do you think you've had sex with?
The fuck?
Well, so I had such a good time writing this conversation.
Jesus Christ.
Numbers are fine. You don't have to use names, okay? Just ballpark it.
Why do
know?
I have to answer this question?
Well, because like I said, I got to write the script this week. And, look, all right, let's do it this way. If I put the number at 20, would you take the over or the under?
So the LGBTQ plus community, specifically trans people, seem to be the target on the top of this administration's hit list. At a time like this, it's important to highlight queer authors and artists who are actively protesting these attacks in their writing, which is why today we're joined by our pal, the author Edmund White, to talk about his new memoir, The Loves of My Life.
Okay, that's all true. But that was part of the earlier, less funny script, okay? We're going for something more like Edmund's book here.
I'm not answering this question. What is your over or under, whatever the hell that means?
Okay. All right, I can say this. My number is sadly below Edmund White's, which is why we're thrilled that Edmund is here to talk to us about, yes, the administration's attack on the LGBTQ community, but also the way he thinks and writes about love and sex in his excellent new book, The Loves of My Life, where he puts his number at thousands.
Edmund White is the author of many novels, including A Boy's Own Story, The Beautiful Room is Empty, The Farewell Symphony, A Saint from Texas, and The Humble Lover. His nonfiction includes City Boy, Inside a Pearl, The Unpunished Vice, and other memoirs, The Flaneur, about Paris, and literary biographies and essays. He's received the Penn Saul Bellow Award for Achievement in American Fiction, as well as the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters from the National Book Foundation. Welcome back to the show, Edmund.
Thank you.
We really appreciate you joining us. In the foreword to your new book, The Loves of My Life, you write, I'm quoting here, because I am in my 80s, have most of my marbles, have been a practicing gay since age 13, lived through the oppression of the 1950s, the post-Stonewall exaltation of the 1970s, and the wipeout after the advent of AIDS in the 1980s, the discovery of the life-saving therapies of the 1990s, the granting of gay marriage equal rights in the states in 2015, the parallel right to adopt children, the brewing storm in the 2020s against everything labeled, quote, woke, trans people, drag, books, puberty, delaying drugs. Because I've witnessed all this drama and melodrama, I'm perfectly situated to view how we got here. So how did we get here and where is here?
Well, I think here is a rather perilous moment right now because of the hostility of the Trump-Vance regime.
Yeah, I was, you mentioned in the book, you have an essay that focuses on the Stonewall riots in 1969, which, you say inaugurated an epoch when partners of same sex could claim, maybe for the first time in history, their common humanity, dignity, and rights. And at the end of the essay, you say, this freedom is something we'll never relinquish, but I'm worrying. It seems like the Trump administration is bent on probably relinquishing some of those rights that Sugi enumerated in her question. I'm wondering how risky you think that might be.
Well, I think that the regime is especially hostile to trans people.
Yeah.
And I have lots of friends who are trans and older friends whose children are trans. So I know how much agony they're going through. And I think they're kind of like a sitting target for some reason. I suppose they'll get around to persecuting gays too, but that'll come a little later.
I mean, the way that the trans groups have been singled out reminds me of the way that for a while conservative politicians would campaign against the idea of gay marriage, right? Yeah. And then at one point it sort the sort of door broke open on that, and it seemed like that would never be argued again. But now I hear people talking about revisiting Obergefell, including Clarence Thomas.
Oh, yeah, him.
um, so I'm just, do people in your life, are people talking about this in explicit terms? Are people just sort of waiting to see what happens? I mean, how's the temperature among your friends and community?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm so old that a lot of my friends are very old and they're more worried about losing Social Security than anything else. But I know, like, for instance, I'm married to Michael Carroll, and his health coverage is on a plan that we have together. But if gay marriages are dissolved, does that mean he doesn't have health coverage?
Yeah. I'm worried about the Social Security thing too. My parents are relying on it. They are. Yeah, it's absolutely necessary. Um,
How is your wonderful mother? I remember her well.
she's fine. She is 83. I hope I'm getting that right. And my dad is he's slowing down. He has Parkinson's, so she's taking care of him all the time, and so they are, this whole thing makes them very nervous as well.
I always remember her wonderful white chili.
Yeah, she still makes that. That still happens.
They're so
So,
lovely people. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh no, I just was thinking about, I mean, you point out so correctly, like, I mean, this is so entangled. I think that so many people's ideas about queerness are entangled with their ideas about youth. And that long sentence of yours that I read that spans so much time was like really helpful in giving me like a long perspective on the amount of change that people have seen, and thinking about, yeah, like the ways that the different kinds of repression and the different textures and atmospheres of that repression have varied. And I guess I'm just curious about how this moment is the same and different for you.
Well, I think our history has a way of erasing itself. So that, for instance, yesterday I was talking to uh, an ex-student of mine who's 29, and he said he was reading something by me, and he was surprised to think about AIDS because he said young gay people in their 20s don't think about AIDS ever. And they don't even, you know, but he did say that he lives in San Francisco and walking around the gay area called the Castro, he says it does feel like a ghost town in a way because there are so few older gays and the younger ones, he says, always look a little lost.
That's interesting. Like it's not, it's, I mean, it's a queer neighborhood, but it's not like in the sense that it's not populated anymore. It's become too expensive, or why is
Not too
that?
expensive, but just the people who the gay population was it decimated means it's cut down by tenths, but maybe it was cut down by half.
Oh, I see.
And there are younger ones, but they don't seem to have. He feels they don't have the same sense of cohesion that gays had in the 70s. I mean, as he's heard about.
What do you think about that? I mean, the notion of, right. I think one of the reasons that, I don't know, looking back at that span of time is so interesting to me is because of the way that queer activists and queer writers kind of like led the way with a lot of progressive ideas. And now you're right. It's so much more like all kinds of activism are more diffuse. Like all of the social fabric is like stretched very thin.
I
Like what
think
would
that's
it,
true. And I think with the gay movement that the original gay activists were all leftists. And then and the well-heeled people on the right just were all in the closet. But then AIDS came along, and it was uh, it affected as many upper class people as it did working class, and so it kind of outed a lot of the uh, kind of um, more important people in our society, and they then they took over the whole gay movement, which meant that the whole movement became more conservative.
That's interesting because there are, I think of Peter Thiel, for instance, right, who's MAGA conservative, but who's also gay. Sugi, what were you going to say?
So, I mean, what you're saying sort of leads perfectly into the next question that I wanted to ask, because you write about Susan Sontag's essay, Fascinating Fascism, surprisingly hard to say fast, in which she argues that the imagery of far out sex has been placed under the sign of Nazism. And you disagree with that take, but it made me think, because everyone compares the Trump regime and Elon J.D. Vance to Nazis. I mean, that's the comparison that's being made. But they also wear a lot of makeup. They're arguably there's like camp imagery that is attached to some of what they do. Whitney just mentioned Peter Thiel. How gay is the Trump administration?
Well, I don't think it's very gay. I think that, I mean, Vance might be gay, let's say, because he does wear eyeshadow.
He declared himself to be so at an earlier point in his life and then
Oh, did he
changed.
really?
Yeah.
I missed that. Okay.
I think I'm fairly confident about that one. I'll look it up. By the way, my mother's 82, not 83. I looked that up too.
Oh, good. I'm 85.
Congratulations.
A friend of mine died yesterday. Um, uh, 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 Felice Ficano, who was one of the original writers in The Violet Quill, and now there are only two of us left, Andrew Holleran and me. But anyway, what do I? Oh, I don't think that the administration is very gay at all. I do think that Trump, being a New Yorker, probably was is probably in his heart of hearts more pro-gay than he lets on. A little like Reagan, who was a Hollywood star and who knew lots of gay people who were his friends, but then later he took up a very hostile stance against gays and completely neglected AIDS.
On Vance, I just looked it up. He talks about his fear as a child, his fear that he was gay when he was a kid in Hillbilly Elegy. The source of this is The Advocate, so I'm going to trust it. Okay.
Okay, good.
All right. So I want to turn and focus on the book itself, The Loves of My Life. Many of the chapters in the book are named for past lovers: Stan, Keith, Pedro, Jim. Could you just tell us some of their stories for our listeners who haven't had a chance to read the book yet? Let's start with Jim, unless you have someone else you want to start with.
Well, Jim Ruddy, I say, was the great love of my life. Although I talk about, I mean, I knew him in the '60s, and here we are, 50 years later. I don't know, but anyway, he was a really wonderful guy, but very athletic, a swimming champ. Uh, a very handsome, tall blonde who also was quite smart. He got a PhD in comparative literature, and um, for instance, when I had to review a book for the New York Times called Paradiso, about written by a Cuban author, Jose Lezama Lima, it was a kind of book almost as difficult, you could say, as Ulysses. And it was like being given Ulysses and saying, and told by your editor to have a copy in on it in a week. And so I relied on him, and he recognized all these 18th century pastoral forms and all that. So he was very brilliant, and he died of AIDS, like everybody.
I wanted to ask you about an essay that includes Bob, a lover you had when you were 14 or 15. I wonder if you could you talk a little bit about Bob and read from the essay that he appears in, which is called The Kabuki?
Yes. Well, I think I'd been reading as a kid. I'd been reading Oscar Wilde. So my mother said she had a boyfriend who was a kind of dim journalist, and she said, "Oh, I think I'm going to get married to Mr. Hamilton." And I said, I just blurted out, "Well, then it'll have to be a double wedding because I'm seeing his son." And that's how I came out with that kind of ridiculous quip. But anyway, he was
My son came out to me in a text.
did he?
Yeah, you've met him.
I like your son so much. Uh, okay, let me see. We were seeing the kabuki form of theater. Uh, um, Relentlessly horny, I pressed my cap experimentally against Bob's. As a caddy, a golf caddy, I tried this technique on another caddy. As we waited on a bench, he loudly denounced me. "What are you, some sort of Liberace?" But instead of shifting away, Bob pressed back. By the time of the intermission, when our parents toddled off for their highballs, we were both erect and chose to wait in our seats. During intermission, we made a plan to get together. We had a television at the time when they were still fairly rare. Bob said he'd come over next Friday in the evening to watch his favorite, the crooner Perry Como. Then he'd drink so many beers he would tell my mother he was too drunk to drive home and ask her if he could stay over. I had twin beds in my room, and she assigned one to Bob. A second after lights out, we'd thrown the sheets back, and I pounced on him in awe of his magnificent muscles. I don't think I'd ever been to bed with such a bronzed muscle man who smelled delightfully of beer and camels, who would French kiss me, who gave me free rein over his warm body, the sort of built up body few American men in that era possessed. Think of Jimmy Stewart's unprepossessing chest in Hitchcock's 1954 mystery thriller Rear Window. Grace Kelly was the most beautiful woman in the world, and one felt she could desire, and one felt she could desire poor, pale, flabby Stewart only out of the goodness of her heart. Men became sex objects only in the 80s. The Brando had pointed the way years earlier and so on. But anyway, this guy was, I think, about 20, and I was about 13. And and then I saw him years later in Paris when he was in his 60s and I was in my 50s, I guess. And and we had sex again, though we were both kind of old and unattractive, but just as for old time's sake. And and it was kind of magical. And then it turned out that he had become a doctor of sports medicine so that he could massage young athletes all day long. And he, he was a professor or a doctor at a Catholic university. And when he died, he left all of his money to the Catholic Church, which I guess needed it.
uh, Probably not. Um, uh, I one of the things about that essay that I enjoyed you talking about and found was interesting, it comes at the end. I'm just going to look at it real quick. You talk about that time, I think you say, when the rich and famous were remote and had been knighted by God and were not the cause of resentment, a time when the three greatest public evils were communism, heroin addiction, and homosexuality. This is like the Eisenhower era. You say that people assume that it was sort of colorless, tone deaf, and uneventful, but it seems to me like the essay is trying to say that it wasn't really.
And another thing I say about that era is that now we live in the era of self-improvement, especially in terms of looks. Everybody's having plastic surgery and on diets and everything. But then,
Ozempic.
if somebody was good looking, you just thought they were born that way. And if you were homely, you thought there was nothing to be done about it. But yes, I think that the 50s was a lot more. I mean, after all, it was the period of the Beats, who
Yeah.
were very interesting, and of abstract expressionism in painting, and some really major writers.
In your essay, Pedro, you write, for me, sex was mostly mental, an act of submission, even of humiliation, certainly not proof of virility. And this book is like filled with joyous, often very funny descriptions of the physical parts of sex. But for you, where does the mental part come in?
Well, I think the the idea of submitting to another person is more of an idea than something that you do ritualistically. I mean, you know, let's say I went to bed with you, and I wouldn't. In my mind, I might be your servant, but in you wouldn't know that.
So it's like it's what you imagine or what people imagine while they're having sex. That's the most interesting part.
I think so. I mean, it's all interesting, but I do think that, like, the difference between pornographic writing and the kind of sex writing that I do, I hope, is that um, it, pornographic writing is one-handed writing, and and it has to not have an unusual vocabulary, and it must follow the rhythm of masturbation. But that uh, the kind of writing I do is real. I like realistically about all the thoughts that go through your mind, the feeling of your leg being cramped, and you're wondering if you're going to be able to come or not, and you just all the things you think about. I mean, Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, said that the comedy begins when the body fails the spirit, and so like the young lovers want to run all out to escape, but they can't get through the revolving door. And I mean, that's the beginning of comedy. And it's when the material world resists your spiritual ambitions.
Isn't also remembering sex part of the mental part of sex? I mean,
Yes, I mean, like, I think that there are like four different quadrants of masturbation, for instance. Uh, some people are visual and other people are verbal. They want to read about it rather than look at pictures. And some people want to recall actual earlier hot times that they had, and other people want to fantasize about new ones. And so I think everybody falls into some mixture of those four.
This is so interesting because thinking about what you're describing, like the imaginative state of play and in terms of the mental part of sex, like how does that relate for you to like the writing of this book, right? Like the revisiting of those mental and physical spaces. Like, is this like I don't know, writerly.
Was that one-handed or two-handed?
It was actually pretty
I
much.
had a more sophisticated question for the record, but let's go with yours.
I think it was more two-handed because I mean, I'm so old, I'm impotent. I don't even masturbate anymore, and yeah, but I do see. I have a very vivid memory. It's probably not very accurate. My sister, who has a wonderful photographic memory, tells me that I get everything wrong in my books.
You don't have to believe her. You just remember that differently.
Okay, good.
So, Edmund, you focus a lot on the language surrounding queer culture. And you have an essay, Hustlers, which references terms like hillbilly hustlers, dirt, rough trade, pencil meat, and chicken hawks, just to mention a few. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role language plays in celebrating and defining and even liberating the way we think about sex. Like, how does language make us freer? And are we any better at talking about sex than we were in the 50s?
Well, I think those words that you cite and a lot of the gay vocabulary was a thing of when people were all in the closet and they were trying to communicate to each other subtly without coming out to be too blatant about it. Or it was a campy way of talking that amused gay people among each other, but that straight people didn't understand so well. So, like, for instance, a chicken hawk was somebody who liked young men who were called chicken, and so there were chicken and chicken hawks. So you would say, this is in the 1950s, you'd say, oh, well, he's a terrible old chicken hawk. And, he, I mean, there were words to describe every position in vice, and it was amusing. It was, I mean, it made us all laugh, but it excluded. It was like there's a private language in England called Polari, which is spoken by gay people and by gypsies and by theater people, and it's absolutely incomprehensible to other people. But when I was young, I knew how to speak it because I had a very camp English friend who was an actor who taught it to me. So like Raya was hair, but it's just hair spelled backwards. This is your Raya, and your legs are your lollies, and so on. But
So is like, I mean, I don't know. I guess I would maybe make a tentative argument, right? That like as queer culture has become more mainstream, you get straight people like me who are like, oh, I am sort of learning some vocabulary of queer culture, and that's part of the. But like, does that make, I don't know. Also, right? It's not my language, and I don't know. And also, like the borders of the community are somewhat porous. People might identify in different ways at different times of their career, but like, does it make it when more people, like, I feel like one thing that is enabling or not enabling, like one thing that has, as more people understand the ways that queer language is used in different spaces, like libraries or whatever, like, right, the Trump administration is identifying words that they don't want to be used. And things like,
yeah, like the airplane that bombed
The Enola Gay was,
yeah, the
this
Enola
picture was
Gay.
removed from the archives by some
Because
idiot.
there was just I think a sweep by a machine of all words gay. So like the airplane that bombed Japan, the Enola Gay, all reference to it was removed.
I think censorship like that will never work for the exact reason that we're talking about. People will develop their own language that will be secret words if they're trying to being repressed by a government entity or by social culture to not be able to talk about things. One of the things that I love about your work and that I find so unique is your openness about everything, about yourself, about how you felt about different people, about your body, about, and a sort of, it's like you're reaching out to experience. No experience is shameful. No experience can't be discussed. That's what this book feels like. And
Well,
I,
it's kind of bravado.
is it?
I'd say that I'm a literary exhibitionist.
Okay.
In real life, I'm not at all an exhibitionist, and oftentimes, like in public meetings, people will ask me these really embarrassing questions, and I turn bright red. Although I've written about that, I can write about it, but I don't like to talk about it. Anyway, I do with you because we're friends.
Has that always been true for you?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of stuffy uh,
You,
uh, in real life.
at one point in the book, and I don't have the page number right now in front of me. I could grab my notebook if we need it, but um, you talk about never yourself feeling like you were like liberated and free, like the gay rights movement was becoming. That you were always sort of behind that. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, it's certainly an aspect of that. Like when I wrote The Joy of Gay Sex, which I did with my shrink, Charles Silverstein, uh, I would sort of pretend to be more evolved than I actually was.
So we're gonna have to wrap up, but we really appreciate you joining us. And maybe I thought you could just tell us. I know you're working on some other projects.
But now
Maybe you could tell us what you're working on.
I've already finished two novels. I think my agent's heart sinks every time I say, "Oh, I finished another novel."
My
But
heart sinks every time you say you finish a novel. Not because I'm not, because I'm like, where's my novel? It takes me so
oh,
much longer to write than you.
oh well, but yours is so brilliant. Anyway, but I'm just now doing research to write a novel about Louis XIV's gay brother, who had a shadow court where everybody had to be gay, and they had to sign a form promising that they were gay. But they were a lot of them just straight social climbers who wanted to please Monsieur, as he was called. So he would catch them backsliding all the time and going out with girls. And but anyway, it's very funny. And he was a very interesting character. I mean, he was sort of brought up by his mother to be gay because the Louis XIII's brother had been a real rival to the king, uh, to the throne, and had led rebellions. And they didn't want that to happen again. So they thought, we'll just bring up a nice little sissy. But he wasn't really a nice sissy. He was very valiant in battle, and the king got very jealous because he won more battles than the king did. And anyway, when the king uh, ate many of his meals in public, and anybody who was well dressed who lived in Paris could come out and watch him eat. And the only person who was allowed to attend him was his brother, and he served all the food. And anyway, uh,
Sounds like you've been having some fun doing research.
yeah, I mean, the king's brother was married to two women, and he produced children, but but unfortunately, his boyfriends got jealous of his first wife, who was the sister of the King of England, and they poisoned her. But the second wife was a very butch German woman who went hunting with the king every day, and the king loved her because she hunted and because she had that funny German accent.
I have to ask, have you already titled this project so we can tell people how to look out for it?
It's called Monsieur because in Louis XIV's court, they thought it was tacky to use royal titles, so they used uh, like Monsieur was always the way you referred to the king's brother. His wife was always Madame. The cousin was La Grande Mademoiselle. Everything. And of course, the king was sire. But they never used titles at the court because they thought that was ludicrous.
Well, Edmund, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your work with our listeners. And listeners, you can find Edmund's most recent work, The Loves of My Life, at your local independent bookstore. And sometime soon, you'll be able to find Monsieur. And you should read all of Edmund's work in fiction and nonfiction. And you can also check out our back episodes and our show notes where we will tag the things that he has mentioned. Edmund, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.